a lot of what's difficult about operating a startup is that you are constantly navigating ambiguity. You do not know what the right answer is. And the most successful people are the ones who are able to be right, even though they are fueled by incomplete information. I talk to my kids, I have school-age children, a lot about how right now school is relatively clear because you know you have to go to class, you have to turn your assignments on time, you have to score well on your test. It's sort of, there's like a roadmap for what success looks like. And what's challenging about entrepreneurship is there's no roadmap. And in fact, oftentimes success is the path that no one else has gone down before, or there is something unique or differentiated about what you're doing in some way. And I think that's really tricky.
You're listening to Customer Growth Sessions, presented by Intergrowth, where we talk through strategies to help up-and-coming e-commerce businesses bring in more customers. I'm your host, Pat Ahern. Let's jump in.
All right, listeners, welcome back to the latest episode of Customer Growth Sessions. Today, I'm thrilled to have on Brian Schmidt, the co-founder over at Hoop. Brian, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Pat, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Excited to dive into all this stuff.
Yeah.
You have a very interesting background. So we're going to talk about Hoop in just a second, but tell us about what you were working on before jumping into Hoop.
Yeah, absolutely. So I first got my start as a corporate lawyer in New York City. I was a trial lawyer doing, big law firm litigation, usually around financial crises of various types. I'm not sure how that happened, but that just was my career for the first 7 years. So all sorts of stuff. We had the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme, and then the residential mortgage-backed securities crisis. So lots of work there. And despite the fact that I was doing a lot of that work, typically for financial institutions and banks, I really wanted to get into software. I grew up in San Francisco. I've always been somewhat obsessed with technology, and I wanted to get into software. I kept getting pulled into financial services, probably because I was in New York. One day, a friend of mine had started a company called Trello and asked if I could come over. And long story short, I did. I did legal work. I did financial work. I did operations. Ultimately, I switched into more of a product role. And that was really kind of the beginning of technology for me. So I was at Trello for a number of years. I went over to a larger company, Atlassian, for a couple of years after Trello was acquired. And then after that, left with some of my former colleagues and started Hoop.
I love it. And Brian, I think I told you this, but Trello is very near and dear to my heart. When my wife was probably like 6 months pregnant, I used Trello to set up a project management list of all the things we needed to do to prepare for Oliver's birth. My wife, I will say, is not a fan of Trello, but Trello has been a huge help for me. I love the platform. With that though, what is Hoop? What are you guys working on over there?
A quick thing on bringing software to one's spouse. I have tried many times. It's a difficult hill to climb. Trello is one of the few things that we did use. And now with AI, I actually am using a lot of Trello once again. But let me switch over to Hoop. So right now, Hoop is very focused on e-com brands, in particular brands that do a large part of their business around subscriptions. We pivoted a bunch to get here, but right now we build an AI agent that sits inside your existing help desk. And the whole point of it is when someone writes in and wants to cancel their subscription, we execute a saving playbook, but from right within wherever that customer is reaching out. I can talk a little more about that, but that's in a nutshell, that's what it is. We're trying to help subscription businesses keep their subscribers.
And pivots and hopefully subscriptions as well are really the two big themes that I want to dive into today. First, just for context for listeners who aren't familiar, what is a pivot? Let's start with the high level.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was thinking about that question, and one of our investors, actually, Annie Duke, she wrote a book called Quit, which is pretty relevant. And the idea is, at some point when you make a bet, there's a time where it's time to try something else. And so when we think in product development about a pivot, or in startup land more generally, we're pursuing a particular business. And at some point, the founding team takes the decision that this is not going to work out for whatever the reasons are. And we're going to try something else. It may be a complete reimagining of the business. What was it recently? I think Allbirds announced that they're going to not do shoes anymore and they're going to do data centers and AI. That's pretty hardcore pivot, especially for a business that went public. For us, we changed course. We've always been a software company, but we've gone from more traditional software as a service offering to kind of AI adjacent, to all in AI native. and sort of more and more specific the further down the road we've gotten.
I love it. And it's so cool because you've had so many different pivots that you've done over the years. I want to ask you mainly about Hoop since it was a little bit more recent, but I'm curious, first of all, what are some of the signals that you look for? Let's say specifically at Hoop, what are some of the signals that you look for to indicate that you think it might be time to pivot?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's something I think about on this back to Annie again, because I was looking at her book this morning, but she has this idea that success isn't sticking to things, it's picking the right things to stick to and then quitting the rest. So that's kind of the essence of the pivot, is trying to figure out what the right thing is. And there are often different markers. So just to get specific around some of the pivots that we did, when Hoop first started, we were a decision science product. So what does that mean? We took a framework for making decisions and we tried to encode that into a product. So let's say you and I were going to say, how are we going? We're going to pivot. Like, what does that mean? What are the inputs into that decision? How do we figure out what time it is, whether it's time to pivot? What have we learned up to this moment that we don't want to repeat? What are the most compelling opportunities that we haven't followed? There might be, a million questions that go into this. For us, we had built things into this decision-making product. And then, in product development, the best thing you can do, even early on, is to bring that product to market and try to get people to use it and then talk to them about their experience. And what we saw is that we were asking a lot. In order to use decision-making software, number one, you have to know that you're making a decision. And as it turns out, a lot of the time you don't. You're in Slack, you're sending an email, you're in a meeting, things are kind of happening organically. And before you know it, you are down this path. And to say to a team or an individual that you need to now go back to a specialized piece of software and go through this structured workflow, it was just too much. People are busy, and it was a lot to ask to get out of existing systems and go into this specific place. There's also a thing in software where if you ask someone to switch systems, there's a huge burden to clear there because nobody wants to learn a new thing. This goes back to like the Trello adoption thing. It's like, I've got Slack, I've got Notion, I've got whatever I use every day. Do I really need to adopt a whole new thing? It has to be incredibly compelling for that to be worthwhile. And for something as niche and targeted as what we were doing, we just didn't see the adoption. There's a general tension also, I would point out, that you need to stick with something long enough to see if it has legs, but you also need to be careful because if you stick with it too long, you can end up burning through the team's motivation. If you are a startup and have capital that you've raised, there's a financial consideration. You're going to run out of money at some point. So there is a tension there with investing enough to see if something is a legitimate opportunity, but not investing so much that you're going to burn out your business from a motivational or a financial runway perspective.
Within that, Brian, I'm curious how you go about finding that right balance between testing enough and not over testing. So let's say whether I'm running like an e-com subscription business, whether I'm running a software, are there certain benchmarks that you would recommend looking at to say, hey, if you have $1 million in funding, $2 million in funding, plan on spending X% of your total budget to test this concept before you scrap it? Talk to me about how you think about that side of things.
Yeah, for sure. So, I think a general rule of thumb in startups is, between 6 to 8 months of runway left is when you want to start thinking about your next fundraise. And your next fundraise is a question around what narrative you're going to tell your investors. And the inputs to that narrative are, whatever the business is, how it's doing. So I'll preface by saying when we made one pivot, I think we pivoted a little bit late. And let me tell you, I'll kind of answer your question by telling you a little bit about that story. So I told you about the decision science product. At some point, we pivoted from that because we felt like we didn't have enough traction from a revenue perspective, mostly because we had no revenue. And then we went into a new idea, and it was informed by AI. And the idea was we had built Trello, which was a task management piece of software. And we had a thought that AI could change how that works by listening in on your meetings, listening in on your email, listening in on your Slack conversations. We could essentially create a to-do list that keeps itself up to date for you, which was great. And that product worked pretty well from a business perspective, meaning we had a couple $100,000 in annual recurring revenue, and we were finding traction with ads. So from a distribution perspective, we were able to have cost-effective ads. So that business was kind of chugging along in a way that felt favorable, especially compared to what we had before. but we binned it. And the reason we binned it, there were a couple of reasons. One is fundraising environment changed dramatically. So in 2022, when we raised our seed round, you could look ahead to raising an A round and you would say need maybe $500,000 to $1 million to $2 million, somewhere in there, of annual recurring revenue. Depending on your growth and your unit economics, you could tell a story that would lead to a fundraise. But once AI happened and startups started to grow a lot faster, now you needed 2-3 million in ARR to raise funds. And we just didn't see that growth in that business. So that was indicator number one. Indicator number two were the unit economics of that business were upside down. And I could talk even more about how that worked, but suffice to say, inference is really expensive. The more that you spend on it to service a customer, the tighter your margins become. And for Hoop, we were losing money per customer. So that was bad. And then the third thing that happened there was that Slack and Salesforce changed how third-party data providers could use customer data, which essentially eliminated that part of the offering. We could not generate tasks from Slack anymore, only email and meetings. So all of that came together and we said, we love this business, we love this product, people love this product, but it's not growing fast enough, the economics don't work, and now we can't do the Slack part. So we've got to do something else. So that was fine. If I look back on it, we shouldn't have needed the Slack part of that. We should have been able to figure out, I think, that it was time to pivot from a growth and unit economics perspective. But it's hard. It's hard to know when to leave because you have customers telling you they love this thing. It's growing. And, like a year ago, 6 months ago, it was a compelling enough story that you could have continued. So there's a lot that goes into it. And some of it is science, and a lot of it, I think, is art and feeling of like, is this going to continue or not?
Brilliant. Brilliant. Now, within that, so I'm curious about the happy customers. What have you found to be a good way to approach those happy customers when you totally pivot the business model? Is it, hey, sucks to suck, we're not building this one anymore?
Yeah.
How do you approach that?
It is really hard. There are still people who write in and say, hey, whatever happened to that to-do list that writes itself? Like, I missed that thing. Can I have that back? Even some of the products that we launched more recently, as we've narrowed our focus to subscription businesses, we've had lengthy correspondence with users about why we can't do the thing that we've been doing literally a month ago. We just can't do that anymore. And ultimately, my approach is to be very upfront. We're a startup. We have cash constraints. We have limited runway. And I love that what we make is useful and loved by some of our users out there. But if we can't turn it into a business, then, we're toast. So I just tell people that, I say, I love that product too. I wish I could find more users like you who love that and have this problem that we were solving. But ultimately, the business case wasn't there. And I have found that, by being upfront and transparent and, talking to people, in all cases, they've understood. I think, when you're acquiring services from a startup, there's sort of an implicit understanding that the startup may change what it's doing. And I think that was true in the old days, pre-AI. I think post-AI, you see companies evolve and change almost overnight. So I think it's becoming even a little bit easier. Again, you have to be upfront. If there's data that we've created that's useful, we give that to the customer. We do everything we can to be good stewards of their data and any work product that we've created. But at the same time, we try and survive as a business. We try and keep that in balance.
Most e-commerce owners I talk to describe their revenue the same way. Great months, followed by terrifying ones with no real idea of what's coming next. So they sit on their cash instead of reinvesting it, and the business stalls out. The root cause is almost always coming down to only having one or two ways to acquire customers, none of them being extremely reliable. At Intergrowth, we help build diversified customer acquisition systems through SEO, meta ads, and content marketing, so that your revenue becomes something that you can actually plan around. Book a complimentary strategy session at intergrowth.com/CGS. Once again, that's intergrowth.com/CGS. Well, and even to your point about businesses pivoting overnight, it's as you said with Allbirds. They went from selling shoes to now, apparently they're doing data centers, which is a wild pivot for them to go through. One of the things I'm perceiving from what you're sharing is that in a lot of these pivots, there are data points you can look at that give you a really strong inkling to say, we don't think this is the right path to take. We need to take a different path. But what I'm also hearing is in a case like the most recent or one of those early pivots with Hoops, we were in a scenario where a lot of customers really loved the product. A lot of people were giving really positive reviews. In your experience, what is the confidence level that you should look for with a pivot? Because I can't imagine you're ever going to get like, hey, we're 100% sold on the idea that it's time to pivot. And if so, I would imagine you're pivoting way too late into the business.
Yeah. I mean, you can pivot too often. You can pivot not at the right time, and both are fatal. I don't know what the right level of confidence is. Maybe it's as low as 60%, 65%. I think a lot of what's difficult about operating a startup is that you are constantly navigating ambiguity. You do not know what the right answer is. And the most successful people are the ones who are able to be right, even though they are fueled by incomplete information. I talk to my kids, I have school age children, a lot about how right now school is relatively clear because you know you have to go to class, you have to turn your assignments on time, you have to score well on your test. It's sort of there's like a roadmap for what success looks like. And what's challenging about entrepreneurship is there's no roadmap. And in fact, oftentimes success is the path that no one else has gone down before, or there is something unique or differentiated about what you're doing in some way. And I think that's really tricky. It's definitely not 100%. And I think doubt is part of the game. And even the pivots that we've taken, I'm not certain that we've done the right thing every time. So we're all kind of trying to figure this out as we go. One thing that I would say is super helpful is co-founders. My wife is a solo entrepreneur. There's a ton of solo entrepreneurs out there. I think that's really difficult. You have to do work to find a support structure and people who have been through this before to bounce ideas off. There are some founders that I know that I talk to and ask questions about, particularly on the operations side, that are really helpful. Groupthink has its own pitfalls, but it is useful to have people with diverse perspectives so you can kind of bounce these ideas around, especially where all of our incentives are aligned. We want the business to survive. That's priority number one. Let's be honest and data driven about why we're even considering a change. Let's look at the unit economics. Let's look at pricing, whatever it is, and then try and make an informed decision, given that there's so much ambiguity about where demand may lie.
Absolutely. And actually, real quick, let's give a shout out to Steffi, because as you mentioned, your wife is a solo entrepreneur as well. Listeners, Steffi came on our podcast, Steffi Schmidt, that is, came on our podcast, I think it was 2 weeks ago now is when we released the episode, which is actually the 100th episode that we released. Steffi has, a couple decades experience in corporate law before she started her brand Fig for Kids. Definitely check out that episode if you're interested in learning about what I would broadly call like navigating the legal realm of starting a business. Steffi has a wealth of experience in that space and did a really great deep dive into all that. But with that, back over to this episode today, Brian. Let's say that I'm working with either my co-founders, I'm working with other advisors. We've decided here's the pivot we're moving forward with. Here's the direction we're moving in. Walk me through, what is the checklist or the series of action steps that are front of mind for you and the team once you've decided, hey, this is the new direction we're taking the business in? You started an e-commerce business because you had a great product, not because you wanted to become a full-time marketer. But here you are, spending a few hours every week trying to figure out Facebook ads, SEO, content marketing, instead of doing the things that are actually going to build the business. At Intergrowth, we take customer acquisition off your plate entirely. No more managing meta ads, no more running SEO. We handle all of the customer acquisition for you, so you can get back to doing the things that actually move the business forward. If you're ready to stop being your own marketing department, go to intergrowth.com/CGS to book a strategy session with our team. Once again, that's intergrowth.com/CGS.
Yeah, absolutely. There's different mechanisms for executing a pivot. My co-founder, Stella Garber, for any listeners who are familiar with Every is a software business, a consultancy, and they're also a media company. So on the media side, they do blog posts about AI and operating businesses. And Stella wrote an article actually about pivoting. So I'm going to crib a little bit from some of that because there's some stuff in there that we used in the pivot from decision science to the task list that writes itself, the to-do list that writes itself. And then we took a totally different approach when we pivoted to, or not totally different, but we took a highly compressed version of that when we pivoted into subscription AI native agent building. So the first time around, what we tried to do was take a framework and use that to inform a bunch of pre-work. So we had everyone in the company sit down and think about whether it was, and I mentioned some of these things before, but whether it is the right time to pivot, what we learned from our previous product experimentation that we didn't want to repeat, what are the most compelling opportunities that we've left on the table that we haven't pursued, and then we've tried to figure out from all of that, what is the strongest option that the team has energy to pursue. Part of what we're trying to do here, or what we tried to do there, was figure out where is the most energy around an idea, because startups, we talk a lot about how startups fail because they run out of money. They also perhaps more often fail because they run out of motivation. So, where are people excited to do a thing? Like, we're here, we've raised capital, let's go do something awesome. So that's a big part of it. We had a practice at Trello and Atlassian. This is a really familiar, simple framework: start, stop, continue. What's something that you want to start? What's something you want to stop? And what's something that you want to continue? And that was in the frame of what we had done in the past. So leading up to that moment. So with all of those questions and frameworks in mind, we had everyone sit down on their own and write down answers to those questions. And then we had people write down opportunity pages, is what we call them. This was all ahead of time. So we took all of that, we had everyone read all of that, and then we got together in person and did an offsite. We're otherwise a remote company. So it's like, okay, so we had a bunch of divergent thinking, and then we converged both physically in Arizona, and we tried to have our ideas come together. So that was a good process because we aired out a lot of sort of what we had learned along the way. It was a tough process in retrospect because it took a long time, and sometimes you don't have time to have everyone spend a week writing all these pages and getting together. There's also sort of a groupthink issue in there where, it's difficult to come to a good decision sometimes when you have so many stakeholders in the room. Everybody has a lot to contribute, obviously. So, with that in mind, that's kind of how we did it the first time. The second time, we locked the founders in a room over a weekend, and we sort of covered a lot of the same territory, but in like a 2-day, like Zoom for 10 hours a day kind of framework. And that's in part because we just didn't feel like we had the time, and we felt like we had to execute with a lot of urgency. We had answered a lot of the same questions, but with much more of an emphasis on, okay, this is a business. We have X amount of capital left, which translates to Y amount of time. What is a compelling thing that we could build that is informed by all that we have done up to this point? And can we do this thing quickly enough that, we don't run out of time? And like, do the unit economics make sense? What would the pricing be? Like, all of those inputs. And so there's different ways to approach this, whether it's founder-led or the whole team. But those are kind of the two broad strokes mechanisms we've pursued. So,
Brian, this is brilliant. I think the last theme I'd really like to pick your brain on the pivot side of things is, let's say that our business has committed to a pivot. We know we're moving forward in this new direction. What are the action steps that I should be taking as a founder to tell the world about and tell the team about this pivot that we're going through?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are internal and external things to manage for sure. On the internal side, obviously, you need to bring your employees along. So, the one, depending on the mechanism, they may have been involved from day one because they were part of the process of developing the plan and therefore are inherently bought into it. If you do more of the weekend crazy version of that mechanism, you need to do a lot of work to talk to your team so people understand the context of why you're pivoting and what you are pivoting to and why that makes sense and why that's a good idea and all the rest of that. And so that's a lot of, getting on the phone, talking to people in person if you can, and all the rest of it. The other critical set of stakeholders, depending on your business, are your investors. I find that, at least from my experience, our investors have been incredibly supportive as we have morphed and changed the business so dramatically since 22. And, the macro environment has changed very dramatically along the way. I think early stage investors understand that they're investing in the team and the dream, and that pivots are part of the game. But obviously, whatever your investor communication cadence is something you want to pay attention to. You want to make sure they know what's going on. Some investors are quieter than others, but I think it's still good practice and good hygiene to just make sure you're communicating. Like, this is what we're doing. We're changing. This is why. Hoop, we do an investor update at the beginning of every month, and we have never missed. And like, we've done it from literally day one, which is a little extreme, but I just think it's good hygiene to just regularly communicate with that. Anyway, so that's on the kind of internal side. On the external side, there's your copy, any ads you're doing, blog posts you have. It may be the case that you have blog posts on your website that are about feature launch. Like, we had feature launch blog posts, we had case study kinds of blog posts, all sorts of, we had task management, philosophy, content marketing blog posts. All of that stuff had to come down. And then, of course, the copy for your principal website has to change. Any assets, like if you have screenshots, all of that has to change. In the past, a little plug for an internal service that we built, but in the past, we used kind of a more traditional website builder. And if we wanted to make a change like that, we would have one of my co-founders who has a design background would go in and make all the changes, and then we would change the copy. These days, we have all of that on our own tech stack, and we can essentially reprompt a new website. So, we can change the copy with Claude Code essentially plugged into the GitHub repo for the website. There's a library of assets, but it's really easy to just change all of that, to test messaging specific to different ad campaigns. And all of that you can do on your own. You don't need to buy any external software beyond Code or Codex or whatever your agentic LLM coding solution of choice is. But that kind of flexibility is great, because then if you do pivot, it's really as simple as sitting down with your code editor or your AI agent and telling it, oh, we're pivoted to this now. Maybe you have a strategy doc you can feed to it, and then have it help you generate a whole new, web page and assets and copy and all the rest of it.
Well, that's brilliant. I was going to say, because I know a lot of listeners here will be built on Shopify, and I was just picturing that it was going to be, oh, here's this laundry list of 20 different places you need to look on your website in order to make sure the copy reflects this pivot. Starting out, homepage, the header messaging that you have, checking the footer, you name it. But I love that. It sounds like you guys have a brilliant setup.
The nice thing about using these agents is they're very, they have their shortcomings, but the coding agents in particular, if you point that at your website and you give the context of we're changing, it can look at everything in that repo or wherever your website assets are stored, and help you suss out all the different things you might need to change. I mean, you mentioned Stephanie's podcast about legal issues, but your terms of service may have been for one thing, and now a lot of that is no longer relevant, and you're going to have to go through and make changes there. Your privacy policy, like that kind of stuff that maybe you wouldn't think about. Your about page, your FAQ, like all the storytelling that you've done around your brand, a lot of that may have to change. So there's a lot, but you can use AI to run a review and an audit of all your assets, and then create a punch list. And you're like, okay, now I got go through this list. Where are all the places I talked about product A that I need to now recontextualize for product B?
Amazing. Amazing. So I want to shift gears and talk a little about subscription management, because so much of what Hoop does is really help e-commerce brands who use a subscription model to keep customers who might be looking to churn, customers who might be looking to cancel their subscription, to keep a larger percentage of them active. First, can you give us the DIY? If I'm running an e-com subscription brand, what are some of your personal favorite, like DIY tricks that I can do or tactics I can do, maybe to keep more of my potential churnees, let's call it, subscribe?
Yeah, absolutely. There is a lot here that you can do and that you don't need to buy, an off-the-shelf solution for. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is going to sound really obvious. I think where a company like Hoop adds value is at scale. So like, we talk to brands that have over $1 million in subscription revenue, for example, and are getting, hundreds to thousands of tickets per day. One interesting thing that we've seen across customers is that about a third of ticket volume tends to be cancellation requests. So people are writing in because they have too much of your product and they don't want to have it anymore. And we tend to see a save rate. So like, if you think about, I get 100 cancellation tickets, what percentage of those am I saving? And, converting that cancellation into a retained subscriber. For a lot of the brands that we work with, the save rate for ticket volume is less than 1%. So that means less than 1% of those tickets are getting saved. So what's that all about? And what are the things that we see work well? First of all, simple is better. If someone writes in and they want to cancel and you hit them with, a discount and, a different product, you'll take like all these different things. It's like, oh my God, just let me cancel. This is like a dark pattern and I hate this. And like, now I'm mad. And what you realize is that this is a very dramatic moment. The customer's relationship with your brand hangs in the balance. They are frustrated for some reason. They are writing in to cancel because it's just like, this is now a net negative for me. And you have an opportunity as a brand to turn that around. So, okay, let's get to tactics. Tactic 1, don't just cancel the subscription. The first thing that you should do is try and understand the context. Well, what's going on? Like, why are you canceling? Maybe they've said it in that message, in which case you can proceed to step 2. But a lot of times people just write in and say cancel, especially if it's like a chat widget, they'll just say cancel. So you're like, oh, so sorry to hear that. What's going on? Like, why are you canceling? Depending on, we call that the probe. So like the probe is like, what is the reason? Depending on the reason, you make your best offer to retain that subscription. So I am subscribed to your probiotic soda. I have too much. Okay, now that's the context. So the offer will be, I can pause your subscription, or I don't like this flavor. Okay, here's a different flavor, right? So you have probe and then your best offer, and that's it. And so, we've seen different playbooks that are much more complex. Typically, the first offer is the one that is accepted and has the best chance of being accepted. But that's kind of it in a nutshell. And I think where AI is really powerful is that it allows you to understand what offers match to what contexts, and they help you suss that out at scale. But if for smaller brands, there's no reason someone writes in, you can't just say, oh, sorry to hear that, why? And then match that with an offer and then develop a playbook from there. One other thing I would suggest as an AI native human is you probably have a lot of data. Whether you're, if you're just working out of Gmail or you're using a help desk, you've got a corpus of tickets people have written in and canceled. And you can take all of that data and you can feed that into an LLM and you can tell it to break it down into categories. You can ask it, depending on the shape of your data, you can ask it what has worked, what has not worked. Maybe there's messaging and tactics that you can change and try. And there's a ton, I think, that you can do on your own just with off the shelf, OpenAI, Claude, whatever LLM you like, to try and better understand what that data is all about.
I'd love to pick your brain on different offers that we should be considering. So selfishly, we're going to talk about the coffee brand that Intergrowth started, a little brand called Sprell, subscription coffee business. Simple as that. Mm-hmm. With the Sprell, let's say we get 100 ticket requests for order cancellations. What are some of the big offers that I should be testing out? It should be really evaluating to send out to these potential cancelees.
Yeah, absolutely. We've worked with some coffee brands. I'm a big coffee drinker myself, so I definitely have some ideas. When it's a coffee or coffee type of subscription, a lot of times people will write in with a volume issue. I've got too much, or I went on vacation and now I didn't remember to pause my subscription, and now I have 4 pounds of coffee sitting on my counter, and I don't want to deal with it, and just cancel me. So the obvious thing you can do there is to pause the subscription. The less obvious and kind of cool thing you can do is to consider a custom frequency. A lot of subscriptions right now are based on a 30-day time scale. And a lot of that is based on operational efficiency. It's just like, it's month to month. That's easy to set up in different places. But as you can build more customized software using AI and other things, you can have a custom frequency that you can offer. It depends, right? You don't want to make it too complicated, but for certain customers, especially for something like a coffee subscription, you can look and try and see if things have been paused in the past, what an optimal rate might be. And it might not be 30 days, depending on the product. The other interesting tactic that I've seen is having a custom product that you use in a save scenario. So not a coffee subscription, but we worked with a supplement brand and they would give a glass shaker bottle to save a subscription, and it wasn't available for purchase otherwise. So that was an interesting idea. Obviously, other things you can do, you can change the frequency, you can pause the subscription, you can skip an order, are kind of the standard ones.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. So I think the last thing I want to pick your brain on, we talked a little about some of these DIY tactics. We talked about Hoop as a great potential solution. At what stage would you say it makes sense for whether it's certain subscription revenue? I know you mentioned a lot of brands are on, $1 million annual revenue from subscriptions that you're working with. But at what stage is it a really wise decision for a business
Yeah.
to work with a brand like Hoop?
Right. So what Hoop does is we plug into your existing help desk and we run a lot of the analysis that I talked about. So we look at all your tickets over the last 6 months. We try and suss out patterns around what is your current save rate? What are the buckets of tickets that come in? Why do people cancel? What are the different reasons and by volume? What are the tactics that we match to those things? How often do we just outright cancel? How often do we ask questions? And then, so Hoop is essentially has like an internal view and an external view. So the internal view allows us to ask questions and run analytics and to test different messaging and tactics. And the external view is where you have the agent is actually responding to those customers who write in and then is executing like that save the subscription playbook. Those two things go back and forth. And over time, we're trying to just increase the rate of cancellation saves. In terms of the size that is right for a company like ours or a product like this, when is the ticket volume becoming a real problem for your business? So either you're just growing naturally and you're hitting a point where tickets are consuming a lot of your time, and you either are going to have to hire someone onshore or offshore, or you're going to have a more efficient business process. We slot into that more efficient business process. We also work alongside existing CX teams. There also may be a scenario where you anticipate an inflection point for your business. So, a lot of the subscription businesses we work with see seasonal upticks around Thanksgiving or Black Friday, or maybe there's a holiday component to your offering. So how am I going to get ahead of the next big inflection point? I know that ticket volume and subscription volume is about to jump. What is my plan to mitigate that? I do think for almost every business, particularly at scale, there is a lot of revenue that is just leaving, especially as the customer acquisition cost is going up and you're like, how do I extend my LTV given that customer acquisition is going up because it's just becoming harder to compete depending on the business. So I think we're all trying to sort that out. And there are a lot of dollars that are right in front of us because we have existing customers who are saying they want to leave, but with just a little bit of inquiry, there actually is something underneath that we can mitigate, and we can keep that customer, and we can actually have them leave that interaction with more goodwill and more love for your brand. And that's kind of how we help facilitate, particularly at scale, when you've got hundreds to thousands of tickets a day, and it's just too much to keep up with human reps.
I love this. For listeners who want to, one, follow you online, and two, want to find Hoop, where can they go to find you guys?
Yeah, absolutely. So our website is hoop.app. We're on all the socials at Hoop. My personal is the very easy to find Donnie Goat with 3 N's. I think we'll have to post that. At some point, I need to figure out how to get B Schmidt on X or Twitter. It's an egg, so I know that it's possible, but I just haven't been able to.
Amazing. Brian, this has been such a great episode. And listeners, check out the show notes. We'll have links to the book that Brian mentioned, the article Brian mentioned about pivoting, and then also all sorts of places to find them online. Once again, listeners, this is Brian Schmidt, the co-founder over at Hoop. Brian, thank you for coming on today.
Awesome. Thank you, Pat. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to Customer Growth Sessions. If you found it helpful, subscribe and give us a review. It helps us to grow the show. Looking for more SEO guidance on how to grow your business? Contact us at intergrowth.com/estimator or email me directly. You can reach me at pat@intergrowth.com. That's all for today. We'll see you again soon.